All right, class, welcome to history, our history subject. And we are, as you know, still in medieval Europe. That's going to be covering this whole rest of the quarter, still medieval Europe. We only have just about 2.5 more weeks left of school for this quarter before Christmas breaks. So let's make sure that we're all staying on top and getting caught up. Luckily, there's only two chapters that are going to be covering for history. For the rest of the quarters. So we have 16 that we covered on Monday, 17 today. Next week we'll cover 18 and 19, and our last week of the quarter we'll be covering 20 and 21. So hopefully this gives you an opportunity to, of course, stay on top of history, but make sure you're getting and staying on top of math, literacy, and the other subjects, literature and science as well. Okay, so history shouldn't take up should take up less time during your week, and so you can have time to focus on the other subjects as well. So let us get into chapter 17. So let's start off by thinking about the monarchs that we have learned about in the last few chapters. Henry II, Richard I, and the last chapter, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and so on, okay? So far, we've heard very little about the limits of their power. We probably might be thinking that these monarchs are all powerful, meaning they can basically do whatever they want. The kings and queens that we've learned about were not all powerful. They had to depend on the nobles for money and soldiers, right? So they had to depend on others for a lot of their power. And they needed to count on these resources, and they needed to keep their nobles happy. So they depended on others, and they had to do their part to keep these nobles happy, or the nobles would not be loyal to these kings and queens. As we have learned, if they pushed the nobles too hard, the nobles might push back. So in this chapter, we are going to learn about a moment in English history when the nobles did push back. So maybe when the kings and queens were not doing their duty and the nobles were not happy, so they pushed back a little bit. So there are a few primary focuses for chapter 17, as we're going to be able to describe some of the problems and events that led to the creation of Magna Carta. So we're going to learn about Magna Carta. We'll be able to identify Magna Carta and explain its significance in the history of law. And then, as always, to learn the chapter vocabulary words, which you are asked to do. And remember, you can get extra credit for this section, this chapter, if you create your own sentence using one of the vocabulary words. Okay, and some of you guys are taking advantage of that, which is awesome. All right, so let's call attention and point out the big question. Okay, so why is Magna Carta so important? So as we read through chapter 17, we're going to learn about Magna Carta, and I want you to look for answers of why it is so important, all right? Okay, so let's begin reading and follow along with me, okay? That will help you get the most out of this chapter to learn, to help you learn the things that you need to learn, to help you learn the things that will help you answer the big question, as well as get ready for your unit assessment. Okay. Chapter 17, Magna Carta. The Landless Son. The youngest child of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II was a boy named John. Although John would become Henry's favorite son, Henry had given his most valuable fiefs to his other sons. Remember, fiefs are portions of land. As a young man, John was given the nickname John Lackland because he did not have any of his own land of his own, so he lacked land. No one expected John to become king because he had so many older brothers. The throne of England was usually given to the oldest living son. In fact, when John was very young, he was sent to be raised in a monastery, like Hildegard of Bingen. He was supposed to dedicate his life to God. All of that changed, however. Except for Richard, all of John's older brothers died before reaching the throne. When Richard died, the 32-year-old John was the sole surviving son of Henry II, so he became King of England. Scroll down and look at this picture. and read its caption. No one expected John to become king. So this looks like John becoming the king. He's got the crown on his head. For hundreds of years, historians considered John to be one of the worst kings in English history. Today, many historians say that he wasn't such a terrible king after all. John did make mistakes, though. Like other Plantagenet kings, he was intelligent and hardworking, with a strong sense of justice. But people did not trust him, and intelligence and hard work were not enough to win wars. Okay, so we just learned why John was called John Lackland, and why was that? Because he lacked land. He didn't have any of his own. And then how did John become king, even though everybody thought he wouldn't? Well, all of his older brothers died, including King Richard II. Okay. A series of defeats. 5 years after John took the throne, the King of France attacked Normandy and Anjou. These were the lands that John's father, Henry II, had brought to his marriage with Eleanor. John was unable to defend these lands. If it wasn't bad enough that John lost important lands to the French king, now he had to ask his nobles to pay higher taxes to cover the costs of war. If nobles refused to pay or could not pay, King John took hostages. And here's our first vocabulary word, a hostage. A hostage is a person taken by force and held prisoner, then often later exchanged for money or other demands. So in other words, he might hold a relative or important servant prisoner until someone paid up. John also demanded taxes from people who lived in cities, especially wealthy merchants. This put the merchants on the same side as the angry nobles. Seems like John is making some enemies, right? John seemed to have a special talent for making enemies. Barons, a type of English noble and a powerful townspeople, were already angry with him. So a baron is a lord, a lower rank in the British nobility. All right. Then John disagreed with the Pope. King John did not like the man the Pope had chosen to become Archbishop of Canterbury. Pope Innocent III was probably the most powerful man in Europe at this time. It was not a good idea to disagree with him. The Pope decided to challenge John. When John seized property that belonged to the church, the Pope responded by sending out an order to close the churches in England. When the churches closed, priests could not perform many of their duties. People could not receive a Christian burial. The Pope wanted the king's subjects to believe that it was all the King John's fault. Then the Pope excommunicated the king. John had no choice but to give in. He agreed to recognize the Pope's choice for Archbishop. All right, so let's list some mistakes made by King John that made his subjects lose their trust in him, or that caused people to become his enemies. So first off, John was unable to protect Normandy and Anjou from the attack by the King of France, so he lost that. Then he asked the nobles and their merchants to pay higher taxes to pay for the war, which they weren't happy about. And if they didn't pay, what happened? They were took hostage, that's right. And then John also made an enemy with the Pope because he didn't like the archbishop that the Pope chose and ended up being excommunicated. So let's think. Why was it bad? Why was it a bad idea for John to make an enemy with the Pope? Well, we've kind of learned the importance of the religion, right, was with the land and how things were run. So why do you think it would have been bad to make enemies with the head of the church? Right, well, religion was a very important part of life in medieval England, and the Pope was the leader of the Western Church. So medieval popes were as powerful as kings, so making enemy with the Pope was making an enemy with a very powerful person. So, and as we learned, the Pope excommunicated the king, which means he got kicked out of the church. All right, let's continue to read. This was not enough to satisfy the demands of the angry barons and townspeople. In 1215, they prepared a list of demands known as Magna Carta, which is Latin for Great Charter. They made a list of demands known as the Magna Carta, which was a Great Charter. It laid out rules for what the king could and could not do to nobles, freemen, and the church. The barons said they would go to war against John if he did not accept the document. When King John saw he could not defeat the barons, John agreed to meet their demands. Here it looks like a picture of the Magna Carta. So, a meeting in a meadow outside London, John placed his seal of approval on the document. Copies of Magna Carta were made by hand and carried all over the kingdom. John died the next year of a fever as a new war raged through his kingdom. Over the next 11 years, Magna Carta was revised several times. The final version, which is a draft or a form of something like a document that is different from other forms of the same thing. So sometimes when you're writing a paper, you do different versions. So the final version or the final draft was approved in 1225 by John's son, Henry II. In 1297, it officially became part of English law. So again, the things that a king can do to nobles, a document that says what a king can and cannot do to nobles and freemen, those that live there. Okay, here's our last little bit for chapter 17. So why is Magna Carta important? It is an important document in the history of the rule of law. In Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, a king agreed that he had to rule according to laws, right? So we've learned about maybe how these kings and queens might seem all powerful, but now we're learning that they themselves had to live within the laws. Many of Magna Carta's rules or laws lasted through the years that followed. A few ideas in the United States Constitution can be traced directly to Magna Carta. Modern democracy, which is a form of government in which people choose their leaders, which we live in, right? A country with this form of government. So we live in a democracy where we can choose our leaders. With its emphasis on freedoms and rights, which is a legal promise, we all have rights, was still a long way in the future. But one of the first steps was taken when a group of barons forced King John to accept Magna Carta in a meadow outside the city of London. So, we just learned that King John couldn't win a war against these barons, the ones that ended up drafting up the Magna Carta. And then the Magna Carta copies of the Magna Carta were carried all over England. And why do you think that happened? Why do you think they carried a lot of copies across? Well, there was no radio or television or internet, right? So the English people would not know about the new laws unless there were copies that were delivered. And then going to our big question, let's review it before we end. The big question is, why is Magna Carta so important? So some key points is, how did it limit the king's power? How did it limit the king's power? And which ways did it limit? Like, what could they do or not do? And then it was a basis or a foundation to what kind of government, right? Or what kind of form of government, right? And what kind of government do we have in this country? And that should give you some tips and hints of how to answer that, okay? And that is our lesson, okay? So I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you guys in chapter 18 for a live lesson, and then chapter 19 will be pre-recorded, okay? So you can watch it whenever you have the time to do it. And again, make sure you're creating a schedule to stay on top of it and finish this quarter strong, all right? A lot of you guys are doing really good. Some are still behind, but I know you guys can all finish strong, okay? So you just have to be disciplined, set a schedule, and stick to it, okay? Just a little bit a day will go a long way, all right? You guys are awesome. I'll see you in the next video.